This is Natasha Helfer, and I wanted to just give you a few updates that are happening at Symmetry Counseling and in my practice in the coming months. I will be holding my first ketamine group session on January 25th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. in our Holiday, Utah office, with the theme being Reclaiming Female Sexuality. There's 15 spots available, so I know that they'll go quickly, so make sure you call to register. We are super excited to be using ketamine at Symmetry. It's an extremely helpful medicine in helping people with stuck thinking patterns. So this is where so many people benefit from, either past trauma or past education, past sex negative messaging, lots of things that you can feel stuck on and you want to kind of redirect and re-explore your body, your preferences, your identity, your joy, your pleasure, right? And we want to get old thinking unstuck. So super excited to be offering this. It will be kind of a uniquely guided experience. I'm going to curate for you to feel safe and to be able to explore a lot of these themes that we're going to be talking about. If you are a current client of mine or past client of mine, I'm offering an additional 10% off the early bird or regular price, depending on when you sign up. You have until December 15th to still benefit from the early bird rate. Yeah, just call the office for information and you will be able to get registered for that. Other groups, I'm starting in January. So my pretty popular Navigating Ethical Non-Monogamy group is going to be starting on January 17th on Fridays from noon to 1:30 Mountain Time. You can join these anywhere in the world as long as it works with your time difference changes. And it will be 7 weeks long, and it is for either couples or individuals who are interested in potentially starting non-monogamy in their lives, or maybe have already been in the lifestyle but are wanting to either get better at certain aspects of it, learn how to deal with challenges in more effective ways. I will also be doing a Healing from Male Sexual Shame group starting on January 30th. This will be on Thursdays from noon to 1:30, again, Mountain Time, again, online, so you can join me from anywhere. And this group is kind of for people who identify as male and either come from purity culture, sex negative thinking, and potentially also were treated under the sex addiction narrative and ways that has hurt them from considering themselves just on the spectrum of human diversity versus diseased or sick or something along those lines. So that's also a very popular group, and I encourage you to sign up for that if you haven't. I also have one of my providers, Sarah Rands. She's going to be offering a group on dating and kind of the typical challenges of dating as an adult. It's meant for any gender, any sexual orientation, and that will be a 6-week also online group. So if you're interested in that as well, call the office at Symmetry Counseling. And I also want to let people know that we have 2 current interns at our practice who are taking on new clients, as well as some of our more established providers. So we do have openings at Symmetry Counseling. I know sometimes people have a hard time finding a therapist with openings. And we work with all the general things as well, of course, the specific intersection and expertise on religion, mental health, and sexuality. So that's a little bit about us, and hope you're having a great day. Please consider subscribing to the YouTube channel or also offering a donation to keep this podcast alive. And thank you so much for listening.
Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we attack shame anywhere we can try to get at it. That's kind of our goal here, especially sexual shame. So excited to have Dr. Tom Murray with me. He's an author, an international trainer, an educator, couples and sex therapist. He's also a supervisor for sex therapy. And so he has worked with a lot of everyday folks to embrace what he likes to call their weirdness, which is fun, shed labels and shame. See, that's why you're on my show. Lean into anxiety and build better and stronger relationships. He's appeared on numerous venues like Huffington Post, the Daily Mail, radio, television, podcasts. And he authored a book called Making Nice with Naughty, an intimacy guide for the rule-following, organized, perfectionistic, practical, and color within the line type. So other than organized, I'm probably I can be organized at moments, but I think my ADHD helps me not be organized most of the time. No, but I listened to you present to our Utah chapter of ASECT, and we were super excited to hear what you had to say. So yeah, excited to dive into a lot of the questions that you are great at answering, especially this idea of working with over-controlled temperament styles. But before we get into that, What else would you like to say about yourself? Why are you interested in this topic? What makes you tick? Just give us a little bit of a window into you.
Well, the basic of that story is that I'm over-controlled. Right, and they say write what you know, and certainly I'm over controlled, as most therapists are, by the way. In certain, and of course, anybody who goes to graduate school has to be over controlled in order to kind of get through the rigmarole of graduate studies. I should say over controlled is not synonymous with over controlling. Right, that's not good. Being over controlling, being over controlled has a lot of positives, and certainly getting through graduate school is one of them.
Yeah. So why don't we talk a little bit about? I mean, obviously, this is not a diagnosis. You're not going to go get a diagnosis for over controlled personality or something. But tell us a little bit about how you conceptualize that term of being over controlled. I mean, coming from an LDS Mormon background, we talk about this a lot, kind of like perfectionism and, people who are oftentimes trying to be really, really good and, really, really great at a lot of the things that they're doing, being very productive. But what other traits would you give kind of this idea of having an over-controlled temperament?
Yeah, so of course, there's the classic description, but to kind of speak to it in more general terms, over control just simply means rule oriented. So having a strong opinion about how the world should be, must be, and has to be. People who are over controlled tend to be risk averse, threat sensitive, rejection sensitive. They are likely to have a high degree of moral superiority, right? So they sense that there's this rightness and they want to do right, by and large. They fear, one of the greatest fears that they have is the fear of uncertainty, right? And so they try to organize their life in ways that eliminate as much as possible that anxiety from uncertainty. And so that can impede things like spontaneity, right? Because that is too uncertain. And so you can imagine how being risk averse, threat sensitive, rejection sensitive, all of these things may play in people developing or certainly helping to explain the sexual problems and intimate problems that they have in their relationships.
Yeah, well, as you're saying that, I mean, I think some people probably come into the world wired a little bit like that, just their wiring. But then I think that there are cultural environments that kind of breed this a little bit, right? So again, coming from kind of a higher demand or conservative religion, there was a big focus on being worthy, keeping the rules, being a good person, following, the mandates and standards of the cultural norms so that you can participate even in, a lot of the rituals and ceremonies and worship practice, right? That people have. So So I'm guessing there's a mix, of people who just kind of lean this way more biologically or genetically or whatever, and then people who are kind of taught to be this way. Is that fair?
Well, how Thomas Lynch, the developer of radically open dialectical behavior therapy, and really the thought leader around this concept of the overcontrolled temperament, does describe it as a biotemperament. And so people come into the world having a propensity towards being overcontrolled. But to your point, the environment can either supercharge that tendency towards a rule orientation, or it can minimize or kind of turn the volume down on it if flexibility was prioritized within that family system. And so I've said this, that there's not enough medication or therapy in the world that's going to make me under controlled. Right. So I'm always going to be over controlled, but I can and have looked at, well, how can I turn down the volume on my over controlled tendency so that the rules are less important than the relationship? Because I think that that's what happens for a lot of people who are over controlled. I was on a podcast last night and we were talking about the host was talking about this tendency to feel disrespected, right? Well, often that is because you have a set of rules that you believe people must follow to be in a relationship with you. And if they don't follow those precise rules, it feels like, oh, I'm being disrespected. But the irony is that respect is honoring the autonomy of the other. That's what respect is. Right. And so it's honoring that people I may have my preferences, but to require that other people follow my preferences so that I don't have to feel the discomfort that may arise and they're not following my preferences. That's the antithesis to respect.
Yeah, that's super interesting, especially as now I'm thinking about couples, right? And sexual, kind of some of the typical sexual conflicts that we see, especially in my community, some of them being like frequency of sex, right? Who gets to decide and who gets to be offended that either your partner's higher libido than you or lower libido than you. I see this a whole lot in the pornography dilemma, right? Because especially the church system is saying this is the rule. You're not supposed to or allowed to do this particular thing. So if you've got a partnership, that's already upsetting, I think, regardless of what temperament you have. But I can imagine if you have this type of temperament, it can be extra offending, right? If your partner isn't necessarily following the rules as you see fit. So what other kinds of things come up for you as far as how this shows up in couples where maybe one person has this type of temperament? What are they struggling with?
Yeah, so often there's a form of sexual perfectionism. So people who tend to be over-controlled and who have problems within their sexual and intimate relationships, you can, when you listen to their story, you might notice or hear some element of sexual perfectionism. And there are 4 types of sexual perfectionism. There's the I have to be sexually perfect. My partner has to be sexually perfect. I think my partner thinks I have to be sexually perfect. And then the last one is society expects me to be sexually perfect. And so when there's this element of sexual perfectionism at play, it can obviously lead to sexual problems. So it can lead to difficulty getting an erection or maintaining an erection if then the mind says, oh, the erection is the star of the show, and if it doesn't appear, then we're not going to be able to have a good time. Or if my partner doesn't ejaculate, what does that mean about their attraction towards me? Or if they lose an erection, what does that mean about my attractiveness, you see? Or if I believe that my breasts are not large enough or they're not symmetrical or whatever, will my partner judge me for that? Does my partner expect me to be sexually perfect? And so that all of those things can impede one's ability to be in the moment and enjoy the pleasures of that moment if it causes psychological rigidity around that perfectionistic pursuit.
So would you say the major obstacle to sexual satisfaction is kind of this idea of being able to surrender versus being kind of in your head about these kinds of things? How would you describe what trends to be the most, the most common obstacle?
Yeah, well, if we're talking about sexual satisfaction relative to partnered sex, that is certainly a quality. It is also important to allow the person's pleasure, not allow it, I didn't like how that sounded, to acknowledge that the person's pleasure is their responsibility, right? That I can't be responsible for their pleasure. I can certainly be receptive to feedback that would perhaps, if responded to, would enhance their pleasure. I'll give you an example. I have this couple that I work with, and this is important. He's a physician and has some background in being a sex educator in like college, and we were talking about how important is it to experience your partner having a good time, right? And we were talking about oral sex, and he through this conversation, he said he didn't like when his partner would give him feedback about his ability to provide her pleasure. And I said, isn't that interesting? That on one hand, you're saying that what you really love is to see your partner having a good time because of what you're doing. And aren't you so fortunate that you're with somebody who's willing to give you feedback so you can experience the thing that you say that you love? But for him, he believed that, to get feedback means I'm not good enough. Mm. When in fact, receiving the feedback is precisely the pathway to be better than just good enough.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I often talk about this kind of in the language of sexual ego, right? Like we want, of course we want the positive feedback. That feels yummy. That feels great. That makes me feel kind of like what you're saying, that I'm amazing, I'm a wonderful lover. But then when we get that feedback that actually would help, I mean, feedback should just be kind of normalized, right? In any type of sexual relationship. But we have not normalized that, neither in the media nor the movies, nor everything just seems to happen naturally and wonderfully and organically. And so then people, that's kind of an expectation maybe that people feel that they don't meet, then it does hit pretty personally. And I'm guessing if you have this over-controlled temperament, that can hit even more personally.
That's right. Over-controlled people tend to resist feedback in general, right? But to your point, to even add, I think that particularly for women, there's this cultural this energy around sexuality that we want women to be sexual, but not too sexual. Right? So we want them to enjoy it, but we don't want them to say what they would need in order to enjoy it more. Right? I think that there's this element, and so it feeds into perhaps some people's anxiety around self-advocacy sexually. Right? That they are, what does it mean that I tell my partner what I want to have a more enjoyable time? And so I think that there can be, for some at least, some hesitancy around self-advocacy because, this pressure to almost contain sexuality.
Yeah, I can see that. I remember working with several clients who have told me, turning it around now to a female client, like if he tells me what to do or how to do it better, it makes me feel naive or stupid.
Right.
Or because and they're coming in with this already wound of, I already feel naive and stupid because I wasn't really allowed a lot of sexual education or sexual exploration. So I'm already coming into this relationship feeling almost like infantilized. I might be 25 or 35 or 40, but I feel like a 15-year-old when it comes to the bedroom because I don't feel like I have a lot of skill or experience, coming from these kind of over-controlled religions. So that it is personal instead of like, oh, hooray, thank you for telling me that you like that pressure or that type of kiss or that type of suction or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that means I'm not good enough. I'm not, there's something wrong with me and I'm going to be compared to porn or to something else that I can't ever compete with. And it's this all, I'm not good enough scenario type of self-talk.
Yeah, yeah. And to even underscore some of that point you were making around shame, think about what is a context that is likely going to result in someone feeling ashamed. And typically, it's within a relationship that includes a dysregulated other. Right? So it's like that if I'm a child and I develop shame, it's highly likely that that is what happens when I'm in relationship with a dysregulated adult. Right? That for whatever reason, that adult couldn't manage their anxiety, couldn't manage their dysregulation that was happening inside when they were experiencing that child. Right? And so they responded in a way, you see, that fuels that shame. And of course, then that metastasizes over time. And that person then becomes an adult, right? And so I have to be careful because my behavior then, what if my behavior is the source of someone else's dysregulation? Right? And so the good therapy is in part the ability to be expressive in the face of someone who has what they call the non-anxious presence. That I can be in the world and be safe in knowing that this person who's with me is capable of regulating themselves, and that mirroring back to me then gives me the ability then to experience my own regulation.
Gosh, I love that so much. It's so well put. And it makes me think, we're both family therapists, so we think systemically. It makes me think how many systems are dysregulated about sexuality.
Oh, gosh.
Thinking every system I can think of, from the public education system to the, a lot of religious systems to, our parents to, even going to a doctor and, talking about, I've had so many of my non-monogamous clients say things like, or my gay clients say things like, because I asked for PrEP, I'm kind of treated in a way that feels uncomfortable. And, they're asking me about risky sex with these kinds of frowns on their faces, and and I'm thinking, who's not dysregulated? And so much, I work with so many couples and I talk to them about kind of like the ownership model. I think a lot of times in relationships and conservative relationships, we've been taught that we actually own each other's sexuality. So I do have a right to be mad about how you're presenting sexually, which means that dysregulation is almost like allowed or permitted or almost expected. What are your thoughts about all that?
Well, that makes sense. And it's less acknowledged that if I have a right to be mad about your sexual presentation, then you must have a right to be mad about mine. Right? If that's the setup, right, then what is the mutuality inherent in that setup? Versus, in my book, I talk about the rights and responsibilities of monogamy. And most people, when they go into that contract, they're not explicit around what those rights and responsibilities are. Well, and how I conceptualize it is that when a couple agrees to monogamy, they're agreeing to the right of enjoying each other's bodies in ways that other people don't have access to. all the while reserving the right to say no to sex, because the ability to say no is what gives the yes its meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's the right. The responsibility is to be interested. I'm responsible. I'm to be interested in the sexual needs of the other. Right? Because the option of going down the street has been taken off the table.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I have to be interested. It's not enough for me to, it's irresponsible to say, I'm just going to turn off my sexuality. I'm not going to be interested. And to demand that my partner also not be interested. That's called forced celibacy.
Mm-hmm.
We don't typically talk about in relationships where forced celibacy is happening, how that is problematic, just as forcing someone into sex is problematic.
Yes.
Right. And so when a couple stop having sex, and I don't define what sex means for a couple. If they come to me and they say we stopped having sex, I believe them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't talk other people will be like, well, we still cuddle naked. For some people, that still includes sex. That's still sex, right? But if a couple's coming to me and they say we stopped having sex, I believe them. And then I highlight for them that if monogamy is sex with one person, however they define it, and they agree that they're not having sex, then they're not monogamous.
Mm.
There's something else. I don't know what that something else is, but let's just be honest that monogamy, for it to be monogamous, there is this rights and responsibility that is part of that contract. And so the contract is broken at the point that they're no longer abiding by that fundamental agreement.
Yeah. Boy, I could talk about this all day. This is so important. And I typically will start a lot of my kind of presentations where I'm talking to couples about this in particular. I'll usually say something like, nobody has a right to your sexuality, even if you're married. But then, and everybody's like, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then I'm like, but nobody has a right to your celibacy if you're married. And then people are not nodding quite as much, especially I think, again, in my culture, I think oftentimes sexuality is seen as this kind of like poo-pooed thing. Like, well, if you have it and it's good, great. But if you don't have it, it shouldn't be so important, right? Because there's things that are more important, like the fact that we are married, the fact that we have children, the fact that we want to be righteous members of the church, and so we have to stay married because that's, of course, the ideal family structure. But there's no prioritizing or talking like this about sexuality. And not that I'm saying these things justify infidelity or justify broken agreements around erotic imagery or a lot of those kinds of things that people end up kind of sneakily oftentimes going to when there's forced celibacy, either that or depression. So it's it creates this squeakiness, and then the person who is doing those things is usually blamed, and that's a really horrible thing, but nobody's ever holding the other person accountable to it. Like, there was something here that wasn't worked out very well between the two of you, and you both share responsibility in that. Even if some of these actions aren't necessarily justifiable, they're still understandable. Does that ring true?
Absolutely. And so many of these things are unconscious to the couple. You mentioned, I think, a value of our systemic training as marriage and family therapists is that we can acknowledge that there are different levels that we can talk about the issue, right? And one of the levels, for example, I share with my couples is monogamy is inherently problematic for desire. Right? Because, think about one of the benefits of monogamy is that it removes competition. right? And competition, when engaged, produces a lot of the qualities that fuel eroticism. So we look at eroticism is fueled by high risk, high anxiety, low predictability, newness, novelty, right? That really fuels eroticism. And yet, what people pursue is low risk, low anxiety, high predictability, comfort, familiarity. Those things do not fuel eroticism. They're important, but they do come with a tax. And we see that in the literature that on average, couples' feelings of lust decline 8% per year. And liking their partner declines 4% per year. So you see this kind of decline, and I think that that's the piece that we don't talk about, is that if monogamy in and of itself was the gold standard institution, why would we have so many problems, right, associated with it? And there are a lot of benefits to monogamy. I'm not anti-monogamy at all. But we have to acknowledge that there are problems associated with the institution that when they show up in people's relationships, they shouldn't be surprised by it. They didn't invent this problem. They're not that special.
I love that. I agree. And again, I get this feedback a lot, because my audience is typically those who either come from religion or still maybe religious. And of course, I get a lot of critiques from those who are religious. And so when I talk about ethical non-monogamy in particular, I get a lot of pushback, right? Like, oh, this is the demise of the family system, and this is just debauchery, and this is just, making an excuse for cheating, and who would want to have that kind of a system? And I'm like, I don't care if you want to be non-monogamous. I'm not saying everybody should be non-monogamous, but it's so interesting how they're coming at it from this kind of, like you said, righteous stance that we have the best type of relationship structure through monogamy. And nobody's talking about very real problems, right? About monogamy. I always think it's so interesting when people say, well, that's really risky to be non-monogamous. I'm like, have you seen the statistics on monogamy? Like, monogamy is risky.
Yeah. Well, what it's getting at for a lot of these people is they equate sex with evidence of specialness. So if you're looking at porn, how does that mean I'm no longer special? If you're having sex with other people, what does that mean about my specialness? Right? And to me, it's far more psychologically helpful to actually realize, oh, my specialness is not so narrowly defined as to be determined solely by what my partner is doing sexually. That seems like a cage.
Wow.
Right? Yeah. That we can help people to break free from. And so I'm not kind of lost where I was going to go with that, but I think that element of this fantasy or this fairy tale that my specialness is determined by what my partner is doing or not doing sexually.
Yeah. I totally, this is my day-to-day practice. I'm sure it is yours too, where people are very offended and feel less special. And when we go back to dysregulated systems, I even will include in there love songs, right? How many love songs are there that are all about either you being the one and only, the soulmate, or, so we again have these very, like, in order to be special, in order to be good, in order to have passion between us, we can only be directed, eye gaze to eye gaze with each other. And then add to that all the love songs. Well, they're not love songs, they're all the breakup songs about, don't take my man, or you cheated on me, or you did this. So it's like, it's like all these monitoring of other people's sexuality, which decreases that specialness, like you're saying. And whether it's a sex toy, I'll see men who come from religion that are very threatened by a sex toy. What does that mean about my penis? My
That's
penis
right.
Special, right? Porn is a big one for women in religious communities, right? That means I'm not special.
I'm not.
You must like her body, or you want to do things that I don't do, or this isn't about me anymore. Why are you spending your energy on that versus me? So yeah, it's so interesting that what makes a relationship special is all the other stuff. I mean, sex is part of it, but like, you're my partner. I talk to you about my problems, right? I go have fun with you. I travel with you. Like, that's what makes you special. I'm not doing that with the porn star or with the sex toy. I might travel with my sex toy, but
well, speaking of that, even notice how you framed it, because I think you're spot on. When men feel insecure, they have this almost disembodied relationship with their genitalia. The problem must be with my penis. And that's, you're unsatisfied with my penis. It's like men, when they're in heterosexual relationships, when they learn that their wife or girlfriend had cheated, it's like, how big was his dick? Right? But when women, if their male partners cheat on them, it's often, as you described, what's wrong with me? I mustn't be enough. Right? When the literature suggests something very different, which is that when women have affairs, it's often because they dislike their spouse. Right? When men have affairs, it's often independent of how they feel about their spouse. It's really about availability, access. Right? They're just having a good time. It's not a matter of how they feel about their partner, but an area that gets, you see it in our work, is that we tend to project the psychology of our own psychology onto our partner and look for an explanation that matches. Well, if I would cheat, it's because I don't like you.
right.
Right. And that is the logic, or the cognitive error that happens for a lot of couples in those situations.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you've done a wonderful job of kind of sharing a lot of the issues and problems and how this kind of shows up. So what do we do about it? What are a few things that people can either be thinking about, asking themselves questions on? What are some of the ways that we can start, one, I think regulating, but two, also kind of this idea of like quieting the noise, right? The over-controlled kind of noise that happens in our heads.
Yeah. So of course, the big answer is buy my book.
Yes. We'll totally link to that, and we will totally push that. Everybody go buy. Yes.
Available also in Audible. The quieting the mind chatter is so huge. And how we, I think people though can tell themselves the story and say, oh, I have to be absent of mind chatter in order to be free. And that really isn't, that's not the goal. The goal isn't to be absent of mind chatter, but it is to be able to notice it with a non-judgmental attachment to it. So I'm just noticing my mind chatter, but then bringing your attention back to the sensory experience. And that may happen repeatedly in any given sexual experience, but you continue to work on it until it becomes natural. The other piece is when you notice you're feeling anxious, lean into it. And that is not the natural tendency of over-controlled people. We tend to want to pull away from things that are threatening. We're risk averse, right? And yet that leaning into it is often the doorway to something special. That if I'm willing to be awkward, and perhaps often more importantly, if I'm willing for my partner to be awkward, now we have play, right? We have experimentation, we have discovery, we have the opportunity to learn something anew about each other. But I think for a lot of people, They feel like I have to be great at it right away. If I can't be absolutely certain that I'll be great at it from the get-go, I'm not going to do it. So leaning into awkward, looking for those opportunities that spike a little bit of anxiety, and then you might ask yourself the question, what is it for me to learn here? What is it for me to learn here? The other piece I would also say, Natasha, is that it includes recognizing that the anxiety I'm feeling in this moment actually may not be mine. It may be religious anxiety. It may be community-based anxiety. It may be my parents' anxiety that I've just naturally absorbed. Right? I like the example, if a herd of gazelle on the savannah, and only one of the gazelle needs to see the lion approaching, and the anxiety spreads through the herd. The gazelle on the far other side of the herd doesn't have to see that lion, but it knows to run. Right? And I think as social animals, we can absorb the anxiety that isn't our own, but we can lose sight of that. Right? We can lose sight of how do these other systems impact us. And when you become aware of that, then you're more likely to loosen your grip on that anxiety and reclaim what feels reflective of your own values, your own authenticity.
Yeah, I love that. And I often add too that this typically takes practice. It doesn't happen overnight, right? It's like whenever we've been kind of socialized or indoctrinated or whatever all the words are, right? To as far as different things, it takes a lot of practice. I mean, I'm even noticing this in my own life. Like, it's been many years since I've kind of deconstructed much of what, religious shame and sexual shame have meant for me. And yet I can be, this far away from an orgasm, and there it is, it just kind of pops up into my brain, something about how I'm not doing it right, or I'm naughty, or should you be fantasizing about that, or should you be saying that to your partner because it's kind of crass language, or whatever it is, that I'm like, oh, I'm not showing up like that good girl that's supposed to have sex in this particular righteous way. I'm still dealing with that at times, and I try to share that to normalize that this is not an overnight process by any means.
That's right. And that was the premise of the title, Making Nice with Naughty, becoming friends.
I wanted to
with
ask
that. Yeah, becoming friends with the naughtiness. Naughtiness is really being radical, right? I'm gonna just do something that just is, that it doesn't have to be big, but it's like, oh, I'm going to, for example, if your sexual dance is you're the first person on the bed right before you're starting to have sex, right? Maybe, not be the first person, be the second one. And so the other person is setting the stage, if you will. Right? And these are just little ways. How do you change up the sexual experience? Asking a couple, what percentage of the time that they have sex is it solely occurring in the bedroom? Mm. And they'll often say, oh, it's 100%. And then I'll have to remind them, you realize that when you pay for the mortgage, you actually are paying for the entire house. Right? That there are many places. Sometimes, if it's light outside, right, and you turn off all the lights on the inside, and you have sheer curtain, you can have sex in front of the window. Nobody can see inside, right? But yet there can be a feeling, oh, this is really naughty. You see, now that may cause people a lot of anxiety, right? To do something like that, and yet. Being, experimenting in ways that, ooh, this is really different. It's only, as Pema Chodron says, when we lean into anxiety, we learn something new about ourselves. Or I think she says, we're getting closer to the truth.
Mm.
right? And so what is your truth? If your mind chatter uses language like you must, you should, you have to, it's more likely that those are authority figures whose echoes are still being heard in the confines of your own mind. And the beautiful thing about being an adult is that we can ask ourselves, well, is that what I want to, is that true for who I want to be? Because if it becomes true, then it's I get to, I want to, I choose to, versus I have to, I must, I should.
I love that. Those are really good words to start thinking about. I'm a big language lover. So, and I love your title, Making Nice with Naughty. I think that's been such a both personally rewarding, thing for me to have started challenging in myself about a decade ago, and inviting people in our offices to start thinking about these things in different ways is really important. And it's so interesting to see how identified we can be with over-identified with the nice, that I'm a good person, I'm a righteous person, I'm a good girl, I'm a good boy, I'm a good wife, I'm a good husband, and we have such that, and even a good parent, like even as you were talking about having sex in other areas of the home, how many times do we hear, well, we don't even want our kids to know that we're having sex. And granted, we don't want to be, inappropriate with children around sexuality, but at the same time, like, why is it that we try to divorce sex from every other aspect of our life? Like, we're kind of in this bedroom, where you say you close it off and you hole it off. It's like, that's the only place. And everywhere else, we're just kind of pretending that nobody's having sex.
Yeah. Well, what is underneath that but a core belief that somehow sex contaminates? And we can even go back to using language like virginity, right? The assumption is that if you have sex and it occurs outside of marriage, right, that somehow the woman, certainly not the man, but somehow the woman now is contaminated, right? And so we don't want to expose children to the idea of sex because it will somehow contaminate their innocence. And yet a lot of families don't blink an eye to exposing their children to murder and mayhem in movies, right? Sure. So it's like children can watch people be gunned down in movies, and somehow that seems okay, but a child seeing a lovemaking scene, I'm not talking about like X-rated, but just kind of two people being intimate, we got to shield their eyes from that. Like that to me is a societal pathology, right? That's just so crazy making.
It is. My best example for this in my cultural context is the book Twilight. It was written by a Mormon author. So it was really big in LDS land, right? And I of course always tease too that this was also some novelty that was happening, because I feel like when Twilight was coming out, everybody all of a sudden was having better sex. There was kind of like an erotic romantic book about vampires and shiny people like having sex or at least being titillated by each other. And so everybody was up in arms and kind of titillated by this. But it was so interesting to see the mothers in particular, because all the daughters were into these books, and they went to all the movies, right? I don't know, there was like 4 or 5 movies, that were based on these books. And all the movies have, beheading of vampires, cutting off of arms, like all the things that you do, you put them in the fire to burn them, all that. And nobody batted an eye at taking. The last movie was when the protagonist got married. So this is even marital sex. They got married and they had this love scene where they were going to have sex for the first time. This is a PG-13 movie. It's not even rated R or anything. And so many mothers did not take their daughters to that movie. I was kind of shocked, even within my own culture. I'm like, this is marital sex. This kind of goes along with your values, as far as what you're wanting to teach your children. But just the thought that there would be this kind of erotic scene was too much. And
too much. Yeah.
Dysregulation.
That's exactly right. And how does how is our inability to self-regulate communicated to our children? Right? It's, children, I think, are they have one job. When they come out of the womb, they have one job, and that is to survive. And one of the ways that they do that is they pay attention to, well, how do these adults in my life solve problems? And one of the ways that they look at that is, well, how do my parents explain what's happening in the world? Because it's how we explain what's happening in the world then we attempt to solve our problems. And so if we explain things that sex is bad, and yet I'm a byproduct of sex, so it's hard, there's that can be confusing. Or that, how is this thing that society says is bad, like murder, and yet I see it all the time, right? That, I think, is just culturally confusing. And yet it's so standard.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I have loved having you. This has been a wonderful discussion. I can already think of 500 people I want to send this podcast to. Because so much of it is exactly what we're working as sex therapists a lot, and kind of like in places like Utah and Kansas and places I've been where there's a lot of what you're talking about, I think, both individually and culturally. And but tell us a little bit about, so where do we find you? Just so people know, this is the book, Making Nice with Naughty. If you're looking at this on video, if you're not seeing this image, but Nice with Naughty, an intimacy guide for the rule following, organized, perfectionist, practical, and color within the line types. So if you resonate with that, or you feel like your culture resonates with that, or your partner resonates with that, this would be, I think, a great listen. But where do we find you? You do a podcast, right? And so, tell us a little bit more about where people can go.
Yeah, so we have a limited series podcast, the Making Nice with Naughty podcast, where my colleague and I, Dr. Francis Robbins, goes through the various chapters, and so that people can learn more about the book there. Also, if people are interested in becoming sex therapists, they can visit my website, sextherapist-supervisor.com, and start that process. Or you can also visit me at just plain old drtommurray.com.
Okay. And we will make sure all of those links are available, including the link to buy your book. So just lovely. Any last minute thoughts or things that I didn't ask you about that you're like, oh, I was dying to say this, but she didn't ask the right question?
Well, I did write a note here, if I may, real quickly, talk about how business sex versus affair sex.
Yes.
Right. I think a lot of people on the OC temperament like to schedule their sex. But what they end up scheduling is business sex. And business sex is, hey, let's schedule a meeting at 8 p.m. on Saturday night. I'll see you there. And then they wonder why it's boring and not particularly exciting. Versus affair sex is also scheduled sex. Hey, let's meet at 8 p.m. on Saturday night. And during the ensuing days, we're sending text messages. We're sending pictures. We're letting the other person know what you're excited about, right? How you want to experience that person on Saturday night. So you can still have scheduled sex. Scheduled sex can be fine. But what kind of sex are you scheduling? Is it business sex? Or is it affair sex?
Yeah, where one builds anticipation and for pleasure, and one can almost become chore-like, right? Or like,
that's right.
Okay, I guess we did say we would do that.
so if someone, so that chore sex, that business, of course, that's. So when people say it feels like a chore, I'm saying, of course it does. That was the setup.
Yeah.
The setup is because it was an attempt to solve a problem, right? In order to solve a problem has to exist.
Yeah.
And people don't typically want to run toward their problems with enthusiasm, right? But if you can, things are either you can either frame the same situation as a problem or as a project, right? And energetically, just holding those two words, you're likely to notice that one feels a whole lot lighter than the other. Right. I cover this more in my book, and people can take a look there or to listen to the podcast. But it's been a great joy being a guest on your show.
Thank you so much for coming on. And I would agree with that. I think what you've really invited us to think about is welcoming eroticism into our lives. And I think that's a really important thing to be mindfully and intentionally thinking about if these kinds of things matter to you, and if you want to thrive in your kind of sexual expression, especially with a partner. So thank you so much for your work and for your time today. We really appreciate it, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Thank you. Same to you. Bye now.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland